Welcome everybody to probably what's one of the last side events of this very packed CND60. My name's Catherine Pettis. I'm the Vice Chair of the Vienna NGO Committee on Drugs. Our chairman I just saw walk in. He's in the back, Esbjørn Hornberg. And for those of you who were here for the previous side event on the SDGs and drug policy, that was a very technical, very important in terms of policy development, and this one is very much in terms of what civil society is actually doing on the ground to help member states and partner with member states implement the Sustainable Development Goals. So we're going to start with welcoming remarks from the Ambassador of Lithuania, Mr. Rokas Bernotas, Dr. Rokas Bernotas, and because they've graciously co-sponsored this event with the Republic of Mexico. And then I will speak, and then we'll introduce each of the speakers. So, Ambassador, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Madame la Présidente, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to remind that UN Gas Outcome Document stipulates Agenda 2030 as the complementary and mutually reinforcing framework for post-UN gas drug policy. The global drug problem is seen by society members as a major concern. In order to address effectively and counter world drug problem and to reach sustainable development goals, we need to work in consonance with civil society. For example, Lithuania regularly invites representatives of NGOs to take part in her official delegations. Demand reduction, respect for human rights, assurance of the interests of vulnerable groups, development of support networks for prevention and treatment, care, recovery, rehabilitation, and social integration in a balanced and inclusive manner, alternative development goals. These are the goals that we need to realize, to work on, and they involve civil society. I would like to mention a couple of serious issues. Global drug problem, especially on the supply side, affects poor societies in many underdeveloped countries. Growing psychotropic plants is often the last resort for poor communities to make ends meet. Eradication efforts push back poor communities back to miserable status. We need to find ways to break this vicious cycle. One of the solutions is to balance drug control policies with the sustainable development cooperation programs. UN Gas Outcome Document states that such a process would be a voluntary and involve alternative development measures. Here, civil society, both from developed and from developing countries, plays most important roles. Alternative development programs, in order to be effective, need the full ownership of local societies. Moreover, there is no single solution in this area. Most often, proposals fit tropical places, but they will not work in the arid zone. Here I would like to emphasize importance of the alternative development solutions for the long-suffering country Afghanistan. Afghanistan has mostly semi-arid areas, and this place is known for a significant production of opiates. The alternative development programs are urgently needed there. Another area demanding attention is the involvement of vulnerable people for the trafficking of illicit substances. Especially often, desperate females are involved in prohibited activities. Here, civil society representatives may play important roles spreading the message about dangers of drug trafficking and assisting such victims in their miserable situation. In order for this to become a true partnership, we need to recognize the civil society as genuine partner in all levels: policy development, implementation, and evaluation. The world drug control policies on this matter should be inspired by ideas and experience of civil society actors that are active in all identified key areas, and especially on the public health, human rights, as outlined in the UNGOC outcome document. How to turn these ideas and the outcome document commitments into reality, and how to remain on this path together with partners, making them feel as true companions, that should be discussed at today's debate. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Your Excellency. That was a very inspiring introduction. I must say, when I was listening to the civil society interventions today, UNAIDS and several of the other ones, they just laid out such an extraordinary vision of what could be and should be. It was really also very inspiring. And we're so fortunate to have the Sustainable Development Goals, which have been approved by all the UN countries as the framework to work in. As aspirational as they are, and as maybe some people who are more cynical would say, as illusory as they may be, and as many obstacles as there may be in the way, it's an extraordinary vision that we have this opportunity to work together to realize. So I'm going to give my presentation on controlled medicines and how improving availability of controlled medicines will help countries achieve some of the SDGs, and then introduce some of the others. So the background for this side event, as most of you know, is that world leaders adopted the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, whose slogan is "Leave No One Behind," in September 2015. And the 2030 reporting goal requires countries to develop policies to achieve these goals, assisted by major funding from global donors. The UNGOC document recognized that efforts to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals and to effectively address the world drug problem are complementary and mutually reinforcing, as we have heard all week. The SDGs build on the success of the Millennium Development Goals and aim to end all forms of poverty. The majority of palliative care providers, those are my colleagues around the world, are unfamiliar with the SDGs, and the majority of policymakers in most of the countries do not see how palliative care can help them achieve the SDGs. And my organization, which is the International Association for Hospice and Palliative Care, would like to see countries include palliative care in their reports at the high-level platform on the goals below that I'm going to talk about. So the aim of IHPC advocacy in the next few years will be to teach providers, and for instance, next month I'm going to Uruguay and Argentina to give some advocacy workshops, how national policies to develop and integrate palliative care through health systems strengthening and capacity building and improvement of access to controlled medicines are key to countries' achievement of interlinked SDGs. Improving access to controlled medicines for palliative care can support achievement of the following Sustainable Development Goals and targets. And I'm just going to go very briefly, because we don't have time to go into detail, through the goals that I think it will support. Goal 1 is no poverty, by providing communicative and clinical mechanisms to help families avoid falling into poverty through inappropriate care and catastrophic out-of-pocket expenses. The World Bank has done studies on how many families are driven into deep poverty, or indeed debt slavery, it's called in some countries, through inappropriate medical treatments. If you have palliative care, that's a decision tree away from that. Primary income earners are often able to return to work through appropriate pain management, whereas otherwise they might just be left in pain and unable to work. Goal 3, Healthy Lives for All, and Target 3.8 specifically, calls for universal health coverage and access to medicines. Palliative care integration requires universal health coverage and essential controlled medicines to support the health of patients and caregivers, and morphine is an essential controlled medicine for palliative care and unavailable currently in 80% of the world for pain relief. So it's pretty obvious that improving access to essential medicines such as morphine, improving palliative care will help achieve that Sustainable Development Goal 3. Goals 4 and 5, quality education, palliative care which supports families and caregivers, and pain relief and home care will allow women and girls who are the world's primary caregivers for sick people to return to school and to work. Goal 8, decent work and economic growth. Integration of palliative care into healthcare systems will require training and licensing of tens of thousands of new providers. At the moment, there's a workforce shortfall of more than 10 million providers at all levels to satisfy the growing need for palliative care, particularly for older persons. As you all know, the demographic triangle is going upside down, and older persons will be the majority in the next few decades. Goal 8, decent work and economic growth, I've already said that. Goal 10, reduced inequalities. Increased availability of controlled medicines for pain and palliative care will narrow the quote-unquote pain gap within and between countries, rural and urban areas, and patients suffering from different diseases. In many countries, palliative care is only available to patients with cancer, and it needs to be made available very much more widely. The pain gap is that 75% of the world does not have access to controlled medicines. Only the wealthier countries have access to controlled medicines, so it will reduce global inequalities. Peace, justice, and strong institutions. Appropriate pain management can facilitate patients' and families' participation in local and community decision-making and increase democratization. Goal 17, partnerships for the goals, which Madam Chair Benta has been talking about all week, which requires governments, the private sector, and civil society to collaborate in realization of all the goals. So to conclude, improving the accessibility and affordability of controlled medicines for pain control, palliative care, global surgery, and medically assisted substance disorder treatment will support countries to achieve at least 8 of the SDGs. And time prevents me from going into the specific targets and indicators, but the point was to give you an overview of how this approach can be beneficial. Work must be done to educate policymakers, providers, and the public about the potential synergies between the operational recommendations in Chapter 2 of the outcome document and the SDGs. Thank you very much. So next I'm going to introduce Natasha Horsfield, who's the Policy and Advocacy Officer at Health Poverty Action, an international NGO working to address the structural causes of poverty and poor health. She leads the organization's work on development and drug policy reform and also chairs the UK-based Bond International Development Sector Working Group on Development and Drug Policies. You have the floor.
Thank you, Catherine. As Catherine was mentioning, Health Poverty Action's work on drug policy focuses broadly on advocacy to create greater understanding within the international development community of the intersections between drug policy and development issues, and also to achieve drug policies which support rather than undermine sustainable development for effective communities. This approach is based on our work to highlight the ways in which current punitive approaches to drug policy undermine the achievement of a large number of SDGs, as I discussed in the previous presentation, and that drug-affected communities have in many areas been left out of mainstream development initiatives. So given this is the focus of our work, I'm going to use my time today to discuss two examples of our approach to influencing the inclusion of vulnerable drug and drug policy affected populations in development sector-led efforts to achieve the SDGs, and influencing a conducive environment for the creation of drug policy that positively contributes to achieving those goals. So Health Poverty Action is currently engaging in two initiatives in particular in this regard. The first is a research project which aims to bring the voices of some of the communities negatively impacted by punitive drug policies and left out of mainstream development to the international development community to ensure their inclusion in achieving the SDGs. The first of two reports for this project will engage communities who rely on the illicit drugs trade for their livelihoods, both in rural cultivation and urban drug trade settings. And this report will highlight the need to formulate and implement development and drug policies in these communities, which are focused on their inclusion in efforts to meet SDG Goal 1 on poverty, SDG Goal 2 on food security and livelihoods, Goal 5 on gender, and Goal 8 on decent work, amongst others. The second report for this project will engage with populations suffering the health and socio-economic impacts of restricted access to controlled medicines, highlighting the need to remove drug policy barriers which restrict access to these medicines whilst expanding access to healthcare more generally. The focus of this report is going to be specifically on meeting the SDG Health Goal 3, Target 3.8, on universal health coverage and access to essential medicines, as well as other aspects of Goal 3 and other relevant SDGs which intersect with this issue, as Catherine just mentioned. I won't go into so as not to repeat. The second initiative that Health Poverty Action is working on in this regard is the creation of the Bond for International Development Working Group on Drug Policy in the UK, which Catherine just mentioned kindly. This is a coalition of UK-based development NGOs working within the UK membership group for international development organisations, which is made up of 450 members. The purpose of this group is to build understanding of drug policy issues in the development sector and advocate collectively for the inclusion of drug policy issues in the work of development NGOs and donor agencies, particularly in relation to the achievement of the SDGs, as well as to represent the voice of development communities in the international drug policy debate. The intended purpose and the reason why I wanted to highlight these two initiatives that Health Poverty Action are engaging with is that they will contribute to the achievement of the SDGs in three ways. First of all, by engaging international development NGOs to include these issues in their relevant policy and programming work, we hope that this will then contribute to their efforts towards achieving the SDGs. The second is that we will influence development donors to include these issues in their strategies towards achieving those relevant SDGs. And the third is that we will achieve increased alignment of international drug policies with the SDGs in order to contribute to their success. The overall aim of this approach of our work is to ensure the inclusion of drug policy issues in the SDG process so that affected communities are not left behind in other largely mainstream development initiatives which are currently happening all over the world in order to meet the SDGs. I also think it's relevant to this debate that we're having today to mention that beyond this work that Health Poverty Action are doing, there are multiple opportunities for drug policy civil society to engage with development processes that are already taking place on the SDGs. So, as many of you probably know, the development sector civil society have been working for many years now, both to support the creation and now the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals, meaning that there are a number of joint initiatives that current drug policy civil society working with key affected populations can engage with to ensure the needs of these communities are included in those existing spaces to support the achievement of the SDGs. At international level, there's several networks and task forces working on SDG implementation, which I don't have time to go through all of them today, but if anyone is interested in learning more about these opportunities, then please grab me at the end and I can be happy to discuss that with you further. There's also many national level processes happening in countries where development civil society are already working with national governments to support the SDG implementation in their own countries, and these provide a really good opportunity for drug policy civil society to partner with member states through those networks. Just to sum up, because I know I don't have much time, in the previous event we discussed the need to develop new metrics to measure drug policy outcomes in terms of their contribution to meeting the SDGs. And I'd just like to add to this by saying that in the absence of such metrics, and even once they are developed, civil society have a really important role to play in terms of monitoring how policies and interventions on the specific drug issues relevant to their work contribute to an impact on both the SDGs at an international and national level, and that engagement with existing initiatives or creating new avenues to partner with development-focused civil society and member states to ensure the needs of these populations are included in efforts to achieve these goals and targets will be one of the best ways to ensure that drug policies and programmes contribute positively to the attainment of the Sustainable Development Agenda. Thank you.
Thanks, Natasha. That was a really great overview. And I remember when I heard Natasha for the first time about 3 CNDs ago, and that was so considered so cutting edge, and now you're so mainstream. What health poverty action's doing? It's like right in the forefront. So our next speaker is going to be Ms. Yorgita. She is the director of the coalition I Can Live, which is an advocacy organization active in the field of drug-related public health issues in Lithuania. So you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I will focus my talk on several specific SDGs and their targets that are related to drug policy and health in particular. It is generally known that a country can only effectively operate when civil society has a strong voice and acts as an equal partner. In fact, civil society organizations are set up to meet the people's needs that are not profitable for businesses and that governments fail to meet. However, civil society organizations are not only service providers to the disadvantaged. They are also professional policy, think tank, watchdog organizations with strong expertise, uninhibited by inconvenient issues, and unconstrained by bureaucracy and political house of cards. An equal partnership of governments and civil society organizations is crucial in implementing SDGs and monitoring the process of implementation. Still existing cases of random, irregular, reluctant inclusion of civil society into policy processes is no longer acceptable if we are to achieve the end of HIV epidemic by 2030 and implement SDGs, particularly when it concerns health issues of those especially disadvantaged. Too often do we still hear that planning is a matter of state decisions. Interactions with NGOs are too often seen by states and international agencies as burdensome, confusing, and thus unwelcome. It has long been time to unite the capacity of governments and NGOs and reach for human rights and healthcare-oriented drug policy. Both governments and NGOs have to make additional effort to work together. Each UN member state must take proactive steps in planning and implementing actions to reach SDGs. Civil society should be proactively included in the process from the very start. On their own account, NGOs should make an effort to be prepared to discuss issues on policy level. In fact, there is no need to invent new mechanisms of partnerships. There already exist a variety of such mechanisms, and if utilized, they actually work. And I will bring a few successful and not so successful examples of such cooperation. Here are a few suggestions of civil society's involvement with the state to implement the SDG goal number 3, target 3.5, which is about strengthening the prevention and treatment of substance abuse, including narcotic drugs. This target covers the prevention of overdose, access to evidence-based drug treatment, and proven harm reduction services for people who use drugs. For example, in Lithuania, civil society was actively involved in public consultations and proposed specific measures on mental health care and drug policy for the newly elected government's action plan. It is also taking the initiative to review the current drug dependence treatment system and propose to the government specific and comprehensive solutions to make treatment available, as currently the availability is very limited. The Lithuanian state is also making a significant progress in collaboration with civil society. The Drug, Tobacco and Alcohol Control Department has recently established a formal civil society cooperation platform on the policies related to psychoactive substances, and the civil society has been acting as an important ally in shaping drug policy. They do so through the platform and through a number of other interactions with government bodies, both formalized participation and established working relations day by day. Inclusion of NGOs into state delegation to CND is a good example. Talking about the target 3.3, which aims by 2030 to end epidemics of AIDS, TB, malaria, and neglected tropical diseases, and combating hepatitis. This target covers the need to depenalize drug use and strengthen harm reduction programs as HIV and hepatitis prevention for people who use drugs. Through a formal partnership with the same Drug, Tobacco and Alcohol Control Department under the government of Lithuania, we will take a lead and join different stakeholders in order to review current Lithuanian drug policy and prepare an action plan for developing an evidence-based, public health-oriented, non-criminalizing, and SDG-compliant drug policy. A similar initiative is also taking place in other Baltic countries through an EU-funded project. The civil society will contribute by developing a methodology for drug policy impact assessment. It's actually hard to believe that this is not done so far. And they will pilot the methodology in the 3 Baltic states. Of course, an obvious example is the provision of specific services by NGOs in order to reduce drug-related harms, including rapid HIV testing, needle and syringe exchange programs, as well as overdose prevention. Unfortunately, a number of these services provided by NGOs still rely on foreign donor funding and not on state funding, even in a country which is a EU member state. Here's also a challenging example. We've had failures in addressing some particular drug-related health issues when a conversation between NGOs and the state has yet to yield results. In Lithuania, a particularly worrisome situation exists in prison settings. Drug use is widespread, and over 32% of all new HIV cases were diagnosed there in 2016. This clearly indicates that the prevention of bloodborne infections among people who inject drugs does not function effectively in prison settings. None of the evidence-based prevention measures are implemented in custodial places in the Ministry of Justice, except for HIV testing. This issue has been on the agenda of the civil society and international organizations for almost 2 decades in Lithuania. NGOs utilized such rather sophisticated advocacy measures as statements at the UN Human Rights Committees, succeeding in securing specific UN recommendations to the state. We also challenged the state in court, including at the European Human Rights Court, on denial of drug treatment services in prison. Regretfully, the UN recommendations to the state remain completely ignored, and a 7-year-old litigation process is still ongoing. The prospect of ending the HIV epidemics by 2030 seems ever so unattainable. We call for the UN and EU agencies to be more proactive in monitoring the implementation of key policy aspects by member states, especially in the context of high vulnerability, health, and human rights. Civil society is prepared to assist in this. Few opportunities exist to build the capacity of NGOs in countries with a shorter history of democracy. In this light, states have a positive responsibility to create an enabling environment for civil society and ensure transparent and feasible ways for NGOs to interact with the state. Civil society should be proactively informed about the process of implementation of SDGs in their countries. They then can civil society and vulnerable groups participate in it. UNGAS's outcome document quite explicitly recognizes the role of civil society and the need to enable them to participate in policymaking and implementation. Thank you.
Thank you for such a clear exposition of the role of civil society and for mentioning prisons and HIV in prisons. You're on the Lithuanian delegation, right?
Yes, correct.
Yeah, so there's a great example of integrating civil society into the delegation for health. So our next speaker is Ms. Trang from Vietnam. She is from the Center for Supporting Community Development Initiatives, SCDI, project coordinator and also the coordinator of Vietnam Network of People Who Use Drugs, VNPUD. As a focal point of project management and communication for a young network, Trang witnesses its growth and participation in major advocacy campaigns, including removal of paper barriers to access methadone maintenance therapy, inclusion of hepatitis C medicine in the health insurance, anti-compulsory detention centers. Trang is also the focal point of SCDI's harm reduction and addiction treatment programs. You have the floor.
Thank you for your kind introduction. Hello everyone, my name is Chang and I come here from a small country in the Oriental region. So before I start my presentations about our organization work and how it contributes to the SDG of our country, I would like to introduce a little bit about our organization. The full name of our organization is Center for Supporting Community Development Initiatives. And from the name, you can know that our organizations operate around the vulnerable community. We are a non-governmental and non-profit organizations. Our philosophy is that we deeply believe that everyone, every individual, and every community has a potential to tackle with their own problem and also contribute to the society. So we work closely with the key affected, marginalized and vulnerable populations such as people who use drugs, sex workers, men who have sex with men, transgenders, people living with HIV, and poor people in the city in general. They are not only the partner for us to implement the project, but they are also the people who guide us through the way. We don't make them to follow our work plan or follow our strategic plan, but they are the one who help us to develop the plan, and from their needs, from their voice, we know what we should do next. With the SDG, we use that as a tool to advocate for our government. Our government know about this, but there are so many issues that each government have to cope up with to fulfill all the sustainable development goals like that. And that's where the civil society like us come in. We support them and we help them in some regions that they cannot touch. For example, for the SDG number 3, ensure healthy lives and promote well-being for all at all ages. For people who use drugs, in Vietnam, they are the marginalized populations. In each policy, people normally forget or neglect the existence of people who use drugs. Like for the health insurance coverage, people in the community of people who use drugs, they don't normally get access to health insurance because of their situation. They don't have identification papers. They don't have mothers or fathers who can support them to buy it. So when the health insurance come in, people who use drugs, who face a lot of health problems, cannot get access to it. So that's when we develop our plan to do advocacy work, to ensure that people who use drugs get included in the health insurance policy in Vietnam. That is the first point. The second point, hepatitis C among the people who inject drugs in Vietnam is 98%, according to our recent research in Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City. Even though the high percentage of people who use drugs have hepatitis C, but health insurance don't cover for the treatment, don't cover for the medicine or testing or anything. So that's where our organization, as a representative of the civil society, come in. We join the policy making process, saying that this is the people from the drug users community. They are here and they raise their voice about that. And at the end of the day, the health insurance cover for right now just PEG interferon, not DAA. So we have still more work to do, and also to let our government know that people who use drugs need more and they deserve more, just like any other human being, and they shouldn't be forgotten in the policy making process. Our organization is also receiving funding from the government of Netherlands, Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We use that funding to do the piloting of addiction treatment model before in Vietnam or in any other Oriental countries. Addiction treatment has never been a real concept. The compulsory centers exist for like 100 years, and nobody cares about people who use drugs getting treated with human rights and health-based approach. So that's when we receive the funding. We pilot the 3 models of community-based and voluntary addiction treatment in 3 provinces in Vietnam. We use that as evidence to advocate for our government, saying that these methods work. People don't relapse as quickly as people get out of the compulsory centers. And our cost is so much less than the cost that you pay for the compulsory centers before. And this makes people feel like they are treated with human rights. So that's when our organizations come in to support our government to fulfill the SDG. I just can. For SDG number 17, partnerships for the goals. Like I mentioned above, we work with the government as the civil society. We don't. Here are just some image of our program on addiction treatment in the several provinces in Vietnam. As you can see in the picture, people who use drugs, they got into the program and they got treated with human rights. Their family members can come to them anytime to support them. They are not isolated like when they was in the compulsory centers. And then they go back, they can support their family with their business, and as you can see in the pictures, they can prove that they can get better, they can heal themselves and they can move forward. So that is the aim of our program, and also one way to support our government to achieve SDG. For SDG number 17, partnerships for the goal. We don't work alone. We just cannot work alone. As civil society, our voice before was small, but then we gather together with other international organizations, together with the governmental agencies. We show them that if we work together, we can achieve what we want. So these are several of our partners: HIV/AIDS Alliance, AIDS Phone, SOS/AIDS, Asian Network of People Who Use Drugs, Open Society Foundations, Vietnam Department of Social Evil Preventions, Vietnam authorities on AIDS control. So these are the partners that have been working with us, and we hope that we can continue and strengthen the partnership to get the bigger goals. So that's it for my presentation. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Trang. That was very inspiring. I think it was amazing that you used the phrase that we use the SDGs to advocate with our government. It's great. And the importance of health insurance. I'm glad you stressed that.
Yeah.
So our next speaker is Randy Thompson, who is representing the our sister organization, the New York NGO Committee, as well as he's the founder of an organization called Help Not Handcuffs, which seeks to remove arrest and coercion from the treatment of people with substance use disorders and from broader drug policy. Randy has worked in public policy on issues relating to people with developmental disabilities, housing, mental health and substance use, and he has advanced the distribution of naloxone for first responders. He's built to support to initiate the city's 10-year inactive syringe access program and also served in elective office. You have the floor.
Thank you, Catherine. I'd also like to thank the delegates from Lithuania and Mexico, as well as the sponsors of this event. It's a great opportunity to be part of this conversation. So as its positive name shows, Help Not Handcuffs, as Catherine was saying, does seek drug policies that prioritize the health and well-being of individuals, families, and communities. And we tread into some other relevant social justice issues. But our work is really done by promoting recovery supports, harm reduction, human rights, and regulation of drug markets. We help policymakers recognize the distinction between the harms that arise from drug use versus the harms that are created from prohibition drug policies. So in the context of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, we have to be sure that our drug policies support rather than undermine our efforts to implement the Agenda 2030. Shifting to harm reduction, decriminalization, and regulation of drugs alleviates some of those harms caused by prohibition, and it aligns itself more with the Sustainable Development Goals. So many of these pro-SDG goals, unfortunately, are very stigmatized. Showing how their implementation will benefit the overall health and well-being of the communities, as well as freeing up resources, will be key to dialogues going forward. And so I'm going to give you a few examples using some U.S.-based statistics and talking about SDG number 10, reducing the inequalities within and among countries. Speaking of ending the use of arrest for drug possession, that will eliminate the intentional harm of this policy, which engenders a social disability that limits the person's employment, educational, housing, and social service prospects due to a criminal record. In addition, drug arrests are racially disparate, so ending this harsh imbalance will bring equality to diverse populations, keep families together rather than forcibly separating them, and leave open more doors to opportunity. On SDG 16, peace, justice, and strong institutions, also recognizing that ending drug possession arrests will significantly reduce police violence and police sexual assault and allow a healthier relationship between law enforcement institutions and the populations they serve. Intensive drug enforcement is tied to a direct rise in police violence and sexual assault. Studies by the American Civil Liberties Unions have shown this. And again, this is done in a racially disparate manner. Even more troubling is that there's a disparity in justice when seeking police accountability, as complaints against police have roughly half the conviction and incarceration rate as the general public. And just moving on to Sustainable Development Goal number 3, ensuring healthy lives and promoting well-being for all ages, harm reduction and some responsible regulation of drugs does create legal institutions that make drug use safer and protect human rights and dignity of the people who do engage in those behaviors. Illegally manufactured fentanyl deaths, which I'm sure you heard about at the CND. There's been a lot of discussion on that. That is largely a drug prohibition-driven harm. Because street heroin is not regulated, there's no quality control or guarantees of how pure it is or if it's adulterated with things like fentanyl. And an example of that is in 2 years in New Jersey, we saw nearly a 10-fold increase in the fentanyl-related deaths, going from 46 deaths related to fentanyl in 2013 up to 417 in just 24 months. Prohibition policy, again, has removed all the legal institutions which would have offered protections for consumers, reinstating conservative harm reduction and regulatory approaches like drug consumption rooms and heroin-assisted treatment programs have been proven successful on removing all, or at least a significant amount, of those policy-created harms. Another successful example I want to mention are the syringe access programs, when provided with sterile injecting equipment, injection drug users can greatly reduce the risk of getting HIV/AIDS, hepatitis, other bloodborne diseases. And while there's approximately 200 needle exchanges in the U.S., there's still very little money to support those programs. And federal funds are greatly restricted. And this is in spite of the knowledge that we know that the cost of a clean syringe is a couple pennies, but the cost of paying for lifetime care of HIV/AIDS is about $500,000 per person. So there's a very powerful financial motive there as well. So these funding restrictions on the state level threaten the goal of ensuring healthy lives and promoting well-being for all ages, in addition to the reduced inequality goal. So a very small recommendation wrap-up is in the spirit of leaving no one behind. Care must be taken by the UN to, of course, engage states and the affected populations, but I would encourage you to listen and give weight to those populations who have been harmed by these prohibition-driven harms, and also to those individuals who have experienced the institutional betrayal that often accompanies those harms from the systematic violent drug policies. Transforming our world towards the Agenda 2030 is likely not going to be easy without first transforming our drug policies away from drug prohibition. So thank you again for the opportunity.
Thanks, Randy. That was very sobering. And there's definitely a lot of work to do, especially in our mutual country, to advance towards SDG. The last speaker, and I thank him very much for staying when he should be heading towards the plenary, is Mr. Isaac Morales, Deputy Director General for Multidimensional Security. I love that word, at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Mexico, and we thank Mexico very much for co-sponsoring this event, and you have the floor.
Thank you very much for convening this side event on civil society, drug policy, and sustainable development agenda. We need to recognize that three important concepts are mutually reinforcing. First of all, I have to say that it looks to me that some of my notes were stolen by previous speakers. So I will do my best to add some views from our national experience. I start highlighting that the government of Mexico has favored the inclusion of plural views from civil society in international policies. And such is the case when it comes to the war drug problem, a phenomenon that affects both government and civil society. This supportive view to civil society participation is a result of an evolution. We recognize it's a result of an evolution, a result of a day-by-day learning, and I can say that our concrete experience is, by all means, positive in this regard. As my government are convinced of the importance of aligning the efforts of drug policy to those efforts to achieve the SDGs, we believe also that we have to align those efforts and experiences of civil society participation in both processes, drug policy discussions and SDGs and development agenda in general. In this regard, we recognize the progress made during recent years, and in particular because of the UNGA's preparation process by the Vienna NGO Committee on Drugs and the New York NGO Committee on Drugs, as well as by the whole civil society task force. My government, we and many other governments are encouraged to maintain and actually to expand this participation not only within the UN system, but in regional organizations such as CICAD, in the case of our regional fora to discuss drugs, and interregional, such as the Pompidou Group. As a proof of our commitment towards the inclusion of civil society in the international drug policy debate, let me share with you very briefly that the government of Mexico has established a working group with civil society organizations which operates through periodical coordination meetings which take place at least one every 2 months. We share with them, with civil society, documents. We receive from them, from civil society, comments, and the result is always strengthening our foreign policy. Furthermore, Mexico has the practice, and let me say the good practice, of incorporating members of civil society in our official delegations as advisors. Such has been the case for at least the last commissions on narcotic drugs, and particularly during the whole UNGAS 2016 process. Furthermore, the series of national dialogues to better assess and formulate proposals to implement the operational recommendations of UNGAS outcome document that our government has organized since September 2016 has counted with the participation of representatives of national and international civil society organizations. In our dialogue, civil society and government and experts from academia and parliamentarians are sitting at the same table, taking the floor at the same moment with the same valuable comments. The solid collaboration that we have established and maintained goes hand to hand with the new multi-sectorial and multidimensional as well approach demanded by the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. As you might all be aware, one big achievement is the more and more consolidated recognition of the role of civil society in the formulation, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation of drug policies. Through a cross-cutting approach that comes from the UNGAS outcome document and as well from the 2030 Agenda. This enables us to continue opening spaces for civil society in all regions and international fora, as I said. A concrete example of the broad debate and learning from the expertise of civil society and scientific community, and at the same time as a concrete experience or example of aligning drug policy efforts and efforts to achieve the SDGs was our own review of domestic regulations for opioid prescriptions. In our efforts to prevent diversion, we made it very difficult for health professionals to provide pain relief medication. Administrative modifications like the development of secure electronic prescriptions have made a huge difference in few months. I want to finish inviting colleagues of other governments to build up on civil society engagement. Just to share with them and with all of us 2 final key words to stepping forward in this important issue. That is, 1, plurality. Civil society has no the same views, has no the same voice, so we need to incorporate the whole spectrum of civil society. And the second key word, continuity. As sustainability, this engagement and this confidence building is a matter of continuity. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Isaac. And I really apologize to everyone for going over time and that there won't be discussion and questions because this is such a rich dialogue. But I hope that we can continue this next year, if not at the reconvene session. And I just wanted to thank all the panelists again. Natasha has to run up to the airport. Isaac has to go to the plenary. and we all have to go back to our day jobs. But there's so much that we can do in a multidimensional way, and synergistic, symbiotic, all those good things. So thank you again, everybody, and Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you very much for the
Oh, it was great. Okay, bye.